Bomarzo is a Renaissance garden in Italy. It is well known for its bizarre, strange statues, mainly representing monsters. And it is also, of course, the name of the game that I'm discussing today, inspired by the garden. As you can see here from the board of the game, there is a representation of the garden. In truth, what you see here in the center of the board is pretty much the turn track, nothing else. So naturally, this has to be the most elaborate turn track that I've ever seen. The game lasts up to 8 turns, and this pawn here is simply taking a tour of the garden. And the game is a sort of like medium light civilization economic type of game. You will collect resources, invest them to get better stuff, to develop cards, and those cards will allow you to score points. But there are a couple of interesting things in the game, including a variable scoring system. We'll talk about that later. In the game, each player has a player board, such as this one, where you place your action pawns. At the beginning of the game, you have 3. You may be able to acquire more during the game. And here you have tracks indicating what your player board produces. Here, you know, this section tells you the amount of food that you produce automatically each turn. Here, the amount of money, and here, how much wine you make. So if my cube is here and the cube is here, I automatically produce 1 food and 1 coin each turn. This, of course, gives me more. This section is to indicate the number of pawns that I have. So if I move this cube here, I get an extra pawn. I can go up to extra 2 for a total of 5. And this is the number of development cards that I receive each turn. And the development cards are these ones. We'll talk about them in a second. The player board, really, what matters here are the tracks that are used to score points, to keep track of score, the turn track here, and these other icons around the board. Here you have cards representing the deities that inhabit the garden. At the beginning of the game, you shuffle them and you place them randomly around the board next to these icons. Unless they are moved during the game, which may occur, these icons represent the number of points that the deity will be worth at the end of the game. So a player that at the end of the game has the majority in the value indicated by this deity, which would be this symbol here, will score 3 points, and the second player will score 2 points. A player that has the majority in this category, the category associated with this deity here, would get 3 points, and the second player 2 points. So actually a player that has the majority in this category here scores nothing. Here only 1 point, only for the first player, 1 point only for the first player, and so on and so forth. So this is neat because, as you will see, there are ways during the game of manipulating the position of the cards, trying to get the categories which you hope to score to get in profitable areas, and to have other cards slide down into positions that will make them score fewer points. Development cards, these are one of the main elements of the game, if not the main elements of the game, really. They're double-sided. One side is gray, one side is yellow / orangish / gold / whatever. These cards have symbols here. When you develop a card and you place it into play, and you always place them with the gray side up first, you immediately score that amount of points in the corresponding category. So if I am green player and I just developed this card, I place this one here, this token here, if I didn't have any token there yet, and next time that I develop in the category and I get points in that category, I move my token accordingly. As you can see, there are also other symbols here. There's just like gray symbol here. This indicates the deity that I need to summon to develop that card. Later it's also possible to upgrade the card, in which case I may get other points here still. And the sort of like ghost icon that you saw here becomes a real icon, a full icon, and that will be worth points at the end of the game. These icons you don't score immediately, you don't keep track immediately, you simply count them and you have at the end of the game. The general idea of the game is that during each turn you will have your little cute pawns, and players will alternate placing them on the board in one of the 3 areas of the board or on the deities. If there is a player, the first player that puts a token, an action pawn there in the wine area gets 2 wines, and then the other players that take the same action after the first will only get 1. By placing a pawn here, the first player gets 3 food, the second player 2, and the third and fourth player 1. Here, same thing, but with 3 coins for the first player. 2, 1, and 1 for the following players. At the beginning of each turn also, you collect resources automatically from your player boards, from the resources that you get from your player board. So, after you collect your resources, you start spending actions, you take some resources from there if that is what you want to do, or you place your pawn on one of the deities here, in which case you will see that deities all have a red arrow or that divides the bottom of the card in 2. The left section indicates the resources that you need to pay to get that effect, and the right section tells you the effect. For example, here, if I pay a food and 2 coins, I can develop a card of this type. That is a card that has that icon there. Here we go, this icon here, as you can see. So if I activate this effect, I can develop this card, meaning I take it from my hand and I put it in my play area. If later I activate that effect again, I can upgrade it. So the develop effect allows me to put a card into play and also then to upgrade it. But again, you need to match the symbol. And some cards have multiple symbols, so that means that you can have either icon, you can use either icon to put it into play or upgrade it. What is also interesting is that, yes, I can spend the required resources. I put my pawn there, and I also place the required resources on the card. Because following players can use the same action, but to do so, they need to spend exactly the same resources that I have there, plus 1. So the next player to use that effect this turn will need to also spend 2 coins and 1 food and add any 1 resource. There is a third player who wants to use that effect. Well, too bad. The player has to match everything that is there plus 1. So going first to select a certain action is particularly powerful. There are even other effects that allow you to take resources from the main supply and dump them there to make it incredibly expensive for the players to use the effect. You can also overpay precisely so that later in the same turn players will have a hard time using the same effect. So there are ways of getting in the player's way, there are ways of backstabbing the opponents that are a little harsher, a little more direct than you would see in most Euro games. So this is for developing that kind of card, and then we have several other things, several other deities that are used to develop other types of cards. Other gods, other creatures, spirits of the garden give you different things. This one, for example, allows you to draw 2 development cards. This one allows you to advance by 2 spaces, it allows you to advance by 2 spaces on this player board here, so on these tracks here. So you get more food, more coins, more resources. With this effect, you spend food, then you burn development card to advance on these tracks here, and you can repeat the action up to 2 times. That is, you can spend 2 development cards to advance by 2 spaces on the same track or a different one. This one allows you to collect resources that have been placed on other cards in case you're short on resources and maybe there aren't any attractive options here anymore. This one is super important card. You take that action and it allows you to take one of your development cards that are still on the gray side, and you see the gray side has those numbers there. That is devotion number. The more devotion is given to one of the spirits of the garden, the more valuable the spirit will be at the end. So suppose that actually I have a very good position in that category there, but right now that is worth 0. So I use that action, I place my action pawn there, I spend the resource that I need to spend, and then I can add a card from my hand, a development card, on the gray side, under a deity that I want, for example, this one. I suppose that later in the game, another player does this with that card, another player does this with that card. So now you have really the basics of the game. There are a couple of other ideas. Wine is sort of like a wild resource. Also, if you have 2 wines, you can spend them to copy another player's action without having to spend an action pawn. But you also have to have the wine. And also you have to spend the same resources that a player has spent, the player whose action you're copying. So it's pretty expensive, but it's also sweet to be able to get an action without having to spend an action pawn. So you continue like this, really simply placing the action pawns until everybody's done for that turn. Then you take your action pawns back, but there's also this other interesting thing, that the value, the cost of the gods changes. If at the end of a turn there is a god that wasn't used, then and it's on its yellow side, then you flip it to the other side, which is the moss side. And if there is a god that was used and it was on the yellow side, it stays there. If there is a god that was on the gray side and was used, it goes back to be cool, and then simply you flip it. So at the end you update the cards based on whether they were used or not. And cards that are on the moss side, so they weren't used the previous turn, have a cheaper cost, as you can see, than the other ones. For example, to use this one, which is when he's in demand, it takes 2 coins and a food. This way it takes only a coin and a food. Some other cards actually even become free when no one has summoned them recently. So you play like this, you update this aspect, and that means that during the game you will collect development cards. You will have your pool of cards, some face up like this, some with the gray side up, some with yellow side up. You will gain benefits from these cards. Some cards will give you extra resources, some cards, thanks to the icons at the bottom, may give you extra resources, extra effects, will allow you to summon the same deity multiple times in a turn, which usually wouldn't be able to, allow you to convert coins into food or vice versa. So you'll have your collection of different cards. You will have values here on these tracks, scores on these tracks. And remember, you will have these other icons here that will count as points in each category, in each of these 3 categories at the end of the game. It's just that if a card is a single icon, then it counts as a point, as an advancement in the category. If it has 2 icons, then each counts as 0.5. So at the end of the game, when it's time to score, you update the position of the deities on the board based on how much devotion they have. These guys here have 5, 4, and 1, and everybody else here has a 0. So we slide down the 0 guys that are all tied for 0. The tied ones do not change the relative position. And then we have the one with the highest value, that was the guy, the balena with a 5. Then we have the gigante that has 4, doesn't matter the side they're up right now. And the tartaruga has 1. And so now, after we modify things, the position, we score. So maybe I'm very good in a certain category that was here, and then things get messed up. And so instead of scoring 2 points in that category, score 0. And maybe I was behind on several other things. I was able to collect in one category that people have neglected, and then I'm able to bump up my category up there, and instead of 0, I collect 3 points. So this is a very important mechanic. It forces you to stay flexible because, again, you may neglect a category, everybody may neglect a category, and then somebody spends and invests devotion there and messes things up for everybody. In general, this is how it works. You collect points here at the end. They are added to other points that may have been earned during the game by the players that first reached these symbols on these tracks. Also developing cards is usually good because this side is better, but if you have cards that are left on this side at the end of the game, you see these symbols. If you collect sets of different symbols, these sets are also worth points. So 3 symbols are worth points, 4 different symbols are worth points, 5 also. Now I can't find the 5th one to show you, but you get the sense. Developing cards is usually good, but the point is that if you cannot do it or you decide not to do it, then there are still ways that the card can be used. This, in essence, is Bomarzo, a fairly straightforward, fairly intuitive worker placement game with these interesting elements that the value of the gods and the categories where you're trying to have majority will score. The areas, the categories that you're trying to score will have different value, and that is part of the negotiation, that is part of the game. I like the fact that things are very relative, meaning everything really has value based on what everybody else has done. And going first is a huge advantage. You can go first every turn in every category. So if I grab an action and I'm the first to do it, either it's more profitable or it's cheaper. And I can really mess things up for my opponents if I get a sense of what they're trying to do. And I dump a ton of things on a certain card to lock the effect, make it impossible. That is a very interesting element of the game, very interactive, and I said, this is not a multiplayer solo as Eurogames so often are. This is really about competition. It's a highly competitive head-to-head race to get to the profitable places first, to figure out where the opponents want to go so you can get those actions and make them less profitable or more expensive for your opponent. It is about getting your categories up here at the last minute possible when the opponent has spent a lot in one direction, neglected one, and then you get that final rush. It's about getting to these points here before everybody else does. It almost feels like a race game to me because the speed, the relative speed within the design, but getting to places first is so much more important than it is in so many other worker placement games. And I like it. I like the range of effects, which is large and allows me to do a lot of interesting things, get extra car, collect resources, advance on these tracks without getting, by using game effects, which feels a little bit like cheating sometimes, but it's still fun. So I have a nice range of effects that, however, does not feel overwhelming, does not make the game an advanced, heavy civilization game in any sense. One thing that may detract from the experience is that it may have an analysis paralysis component, not with all players, but with some. This is a game that can play fast, and actually, with the right group of players, this works very smoothly because you only have 3 tops 5 action pawns, doom, 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 and more or less I get a sense of what I want to do. I adjust because darn, you just grab that action that I wanted. But it shouldn't have too much analysis paralysis. It can play fast. At the end of the day, you have 3 action points. You have 8 turns. If you don't get any extra action points, if you don't copy a lot of actions, then you will have the base number of actions that you have is 24. If you copy a couple of times, you add some actions. If you get action points, you get many. But it's a fairly minimalistic game. You really have to maximize what you want to do. You have to decide what you want to do. You have to have a clear sense of where you want to achieve majority. And again, it's about not sticking to your plan when the situation changes, which happens all the time, and being able to adjust. But it is about looking ahead and having some sort of plan for the future. And when you have that in mind, that should help with analysis paralysis. But that being said, in the last couple of turns, it is entirely possible that you will have some players that will obsess and they will try to count all the icons that everybody has, which is a problem because these icons here, remember, those are not tracked during the game. It's just at the end I count, okay, you have 3 books and I have 2 books. And we are 1 turn from the end, so maybe you should manipulate things here so that the category that helps you is not up here and the category that helps me is not up here. So since some of the categories are not tracked throughout the game, then you may have players that want to go around and check everything and then see how much they can spend to improve their conditions while at the same time still doing other things. There is a potential for that in here. It shouldn't be too big because the game, again, overall can flow very well, can be played in under an hour with experienced players, but it has that element. Bomarzo in general, I was pleasantly surprised. Well, I was curious about the game simply because of the theme and the art, albeit that's as simple as that. I'm in Italy also right now, and I wanted to explore some Italian designs. There's an Italian design that also has an Italian theme, so that seemed interesting to me. It's a fun and neat game. It feels very tight, claustrophobic at times, claustrophobic because of the small number of actions that you have and because of this constant competition for resources that seem to be depleting themselves very fast. Actions that lose their effectiveness as other players collect them and use them and make them expensive. You really have this sense of a scarcity of resources that players are competing with. So it is a game that it's a Euro game with I wouldn't say unique flavor, with a unique feel, but it has a strong personality based around this idea of scarcity and strong competition. In general, it's not the simplest game that there is out there, but definitely not an advanced civilization game by any means either. Bomarzo, definitely an enjoyable game with the right group, without analysis paralysis players, and for players that want a nice, interesting challenge, with all of the nice challenges that you have in civilization economic games, without the headaches. Because luckily enough, unless you are arguing with a player that creates analysis paralysis, this is not a game that should give you too much of a headache, too much of a brain burn. Bomarzo, overall, a good game, fun game, one that I enjoyed playing.